John K. Herr. Major John K. Herr was renowned for being a passionate defender of horses in modern warfare. Born October 1, 1878, Herr's career spanned an era when the U.S. Army was transitioning from sabers and saddles to mechanized infantry and war tanks. By the late 1930s, as technology gradually began reshaping the military doctrine, Herr, almost alone, stood arguing that the cavalry still had an important role to play. At the time, officers like Howze Jr., also known as the father of armored forces, assumed Herr was stubbornly clinging to tradition when the world was already moving on. But Herr was relentless. He tried convincing the government that the horse provided speed, flexibility, and mobility in terrains where vehicles bogged down, like in the jungles, mountains, and rough countryside. His convincing argument was met with a brick wall. An opportunity soon presented itself as the Pacific War raged on. To prove his theory, he cited the famous Philippine Scouts when Japan struck the Philippines on December 8, 1941. 26th Cavalry Regiment, also known as the Philippine Scouts, composed of brave men trained in the spirit of his doctrine to battle against armored forces, infantry, and aircraft. They marched off to the Philippines to fight in one of the most dramatic battles of the war, and they executed what is often called the last cavalry charge in U.S. military history at Morong, Bataan. They fought off the Japanese troops with rifles, pistols, and sabers, delaying their plans to invade. Even though they could not successfully send the Japanese back, they bought the American and Filipino troops more time to regroup, gather up supplies, and join in the war. However, his references were met with some disapproval, particularly from Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, who viewed Herr's obsession with cavalry as weakening the U.S. preparedness for mechanized warfare. He was harshly referred to as the man who lost it all for the institution of the U.S. cavalry, in the words of General Robert W. Grow. Many of his opponents pointed out how Germany's Blitzkrieg, a German military tactic that employed combined arms, swept swiftly across Europe with tanks and aircraft, while the U.S. lagged in armored doctrine. But did he deserve such a severe verdict? This was a man whose tactics and doctrines bravely repelled the Japanese. Recently, some historians have begun to argue in his favor. Considerable evidence hints at Herr's plan to bridge the gap between mounted and mechanized forces with emphasis on mobility and adaptability. Eventually, he was defeated by the enemies of the horse cavalry and forced to retire. What makes Major General John Herr interesting is not the fact that he was right or wrong, but how he symbolized the clash of two worlds. His career was basically a fight against time. It was a race between tradition and innovation. By the time he retired in 1942, the cavalry he knew had become overshadowed by tanks and armor. Herr's faith in the horse left behind one of the war's most enduring legends, that despite the world's gradual transition to mechanization, the cavalry still had its moment. Refusing to let the horse die quietly, he ensured it wrote into history one last time. Colonel Charles H. Reed. If Herr represented the philosophy of cavalry, then Colonel Charles H. Reed is definitely the action. Reed carried the torch of the mounted soldier into the raging World War II. He was unlike Herr, who mostly fought his battles in doctrine and headquarters debates. Reed was a man of action, ready to fight on any plain, whether it was mud, jungle, or on the fields. Colonel Charles H. Reed, serving in Europe, became famous for saving horses. He helped rescue the priceless Lipizzaner horses in 1945 during Operation Cowboy. Reed graduated from West Point in 1922 as a career soldier in cavalry. As an elite horseman, he served with the 8th Cavalry at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later became the operations officer for an all-black unit, the 10th Cavalry, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers. By the time the U.S. entered World War II, tanks were replacing the cavalry, and Reed was promoted to colonel. He commanded the 2nd Cavalry Group, a light tank unit that acted as a reconnaissance and security unit. Reed and his men fought against the Germans in the European theater, and this earned him the Distinguished Service Cross and the French Legion of Honor for his heroism in France. In late April 1945, Reed got news from German officers guarding the famous Lipizzaner stallions and other prized horses in hostile Czechoslovakia. The officers feared the advancing Red Army would slaughter them. A horseman at heart, he personally led a mounted charge after getting the approval of General George S. Patton. His courage was infectious. Soon enough, a small, mixed force of American soldiers, freed Allied prisoners of war, and even some German soldiers in support of freeing the horse, ventured out to the fields with their pistols out, firing while the sabers were flashing. The American troops successfully herded and transported over 1,200 horses, including the prize Lipizaners, to safety behind Allied lines. Today, historians still debate Reed's legacy. Was his cavalry charge an act of reckless nostalgia or an extraordinary moment of leadership? Either way, Reed's name is permanently linked to the last great charge of American horse soldiers. He proved that, under the right leader, cavalry could still matter, even in the deadliest war humanity had ever seen. General George S. Patton, Jr. Since we're still on the cavalry route shaping warfare, we've got to include the most famous one of them all, General George S. Patton, Jr. Long before he became famous for his aggressive style as a war commander, Patton was a horse soldier. He trained in traditional cavalry tactics, mastered the saber, and even competed in the 1912 Olympics as a pentathlete, riding with the precision of a cavalryman. He even wrote the Army's official manual on the saber. His early days were dedicated to learning the ways of the saddle, absorbing the speed, aggression, and shock tactics that have defined cavalry warfare for centuries. The war tanks and modern technology rolled in during World War I, and Patton transferred all his cavalry skills to machines made of steel. He rode the tanks like horses. He was fast, bold, and always ahead in his style of leadership. Despite all his bravery, he was known as America's Achilles heel. Why? Because he was volatile, impulsive, and often reckless. He was quite strict and demanding and would drill them until they dropped. Any sign of weakness was punished without mercy. "Lead me, follow me, or get out of my way," was his famous quote. His troops feared and adored him. Once in Sicily, he slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. This act nearly ruined his military career as the news spread like wildfire until it got to the American press. To his critics, this was enough proof that he was a dangerous man, incapable of being a leader. And yet, when the war reached its darkest hour, it was Patton's restless nature that turned the tide of the war. In December 1944, the Allies were forced to retreat from the German offensive, but not Patton. He wheeled his entire army, hundreds and thousands of soldiers, against the chilling weather up north in just 2 days, saving the surrounded town of Bastogne and crushing Hitler's last hope in the West. He proved that his cavalry roots were more than tradition. They were the essence of his unique style. However, his victories didn't stop the critics. His harsh discipline was one thing, his inability to stay silent about politics and his fiery speeches was another thing. Both constantly put him at odds with the Allied command. And although he was a hero to many, he was deemed a dangerous romantic trapped in another century. Colonel Harry H. Johnson. And so was Colonel Harry H. Johnson. When General George S. Patton, Jr. was being transferred to the age of tanks, Colonel Harry H. Johnson was still on the saddles, literally. Johnson's life started far from the thunder of war in a little Texas town of Glen Flora. His mother died when he was only 13. With no support, he worked his way through Texas A&M and Tyler's Community College before the Great War swept him into uniform. In 1917, he joined the 36th Division, fought in the bloody Meuse-Argonne offensive, and survived the French trenches. For a young boy from rural Texas, it was a terrible reality, a harsh education in leadership and endurance. Between the wars, he returned to civilian life, working as an oil salesman for Gulf Oil. His time as a soldier never really left him, and it was not long before he had to put on his military boots and march toward the Texas National Guard's 124th Cavalry Regiment. This was one of the Army's last mounted units, and here he patrolled the borders while he was consistently drilled until he became a seasoned horseman. Steeped in the old war traditions, but watching how the world had begun turning to steel and machines for victory. Although trained to fight, Johnson wasn't prepared for the disaster World War II brought. He was thrust into the thick of the war and strived for victory. He became the commander of the 7th and 8th Cavalry Regiments of the 1st Cavalry Division and then the 56th Cavalry Brigade. While most commanders were learning to fight the modern way, Johnson was leading horse soldiers to victory on the war front. His leadership style and tactics earned him the position of Brigadier General in 1943. However, a year later, his career took a dramatic turn. Rome fell to the Allies in June 1944, And with Rome liberated, there was a need to appoint a ruler. The next day after Rome's liberation, President Roosevelt sent for Harry H. Johnson and appointed him immediately as military governor of Rome. It was an extraordinary honor for a formerly mounted officer to oversee one of the most historic capitals in Europe. Johnson's most unusual command came in 1944 when he was given leadership of the 2nd Segregated Cavalry Division. But the divisions reflected the Army's unease with how to use African American soldiers in combat. Under his leadership, the 2nd Cavalry Division was dismounted from horses and reassigned to service and support roles during the North Africa campaign. After seeing the vital role he played in August 1944, and with the unit, he was transferred to command the 93rd Infantry Division, the 2nd Segregated Formation. Their duty was to carry out labor, engineering, and logistical tasks in the New Guinea and Philippines campaigns. Although denied frontline combat, his men built roads, unloaded ships, and maintained supply lines under fire. While his commands were not the glamorously armored divisions of Patton, they were just as vital in keeping the Allied machine running. After the war, he went right back to his job at the Gulf Oil, blending his civilian duty with military service. He even headed a Mexico-U.S. commission to tackle hoof and mouth disease, vaccinating millions of cattle. After all his years of service, Johnson retired in 1958 and passed away in 1986, leaving behind a legacy of diligence and dedication. Few cavalrymen ended the war with such grace, attaining a political position, overseeing supplies while balancing relations with both Italians and Allied forces. Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Howze. When you think of the last generation of American cavalrymen, two names always stand out: Major General John K. Herr and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Howze Jr. Herr, the last U.S. Chief of Cavalry, was known to be the stubborn defender of the horse, refusing to let centuries of tradition vanish without a fight. Howze, on the other hand, represented the younger officer corps, loyal, disciplined, and carrying the weight of the family legacy. Born in 1908 at West Point, New York, the son of Medal of Honor recipient Robert Lee Howze, he seemed destined to wear the cavalry saber. He graduated from West Point in 1930, a fourth-generation officer, just as the U.S. Army was phasing out horses in favor of machines. With Herr disappointed and retired, the cavalry was dropped for a more mechanized method. However, Howze carried the cavalry spirit into the new era. One of the most unique aspects of his command was his command of mechanized cavalry in Europe. His units were often assigned duties far ahead of the main Allied troops. In many cases, his squadrons were among the first nationals to see towns liberated. A 1994 report from the U.S. Army Official History describes Howze's men racing into French villages with engines roaring and flags flying, much like the cavalry riders of an earlier century. Howze grew up in a culture where speed, mobility, and audacity defined a soldier's worth. But while others fought the last charges of the horse, Howze took those same instincts into a different arena. During World War II, he served with the 1st Armored Division in North Africa and Italy. There, he commanded battalions and regiments of tanks, applying the old cavalry logic to new machines. Instead of sabers and mounts, he maneuvered Shermans and half-tracks. Instead of galloping across fields, his men rolled across deserts and mountains. His ability to move fast, hit hard, and exploit surprise became the hallmark of his leadership. Yet Howze's true impact went beyond the battlefields of Italy. After the war, when many thought the cavalry tradition had vanished into nostalgia, Howze reinvented it. From 1955 to 1958, he served as the first director of Army Aviation, and the role gave him the freedom to experiment with helicopters. In 1962, President Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara tasked him with leading the Tactical Mobility Requirements Board, known simply as the Howze Board. What emerged was revolutionary. Howze argued that helicopters could become the new cavalry. Helicopters were efficient and fast and would give soldiers speed, mobility, and shock effect far beyond what tanks or horses ever could. The board's recommendations birthed the concept of the air cavalry units designed to strike suddenly, maneuver across battlefields, and support infantry with fire and logistics. The proof came in Vietnam, where air cavalry brigades transformed the way wars were fought. Instead of sabers or pistols on horses charging, Hueys and Cobras descended from the sky, delivering troops with the same audacity and shock that cavalrymen had once carried in their blood. For this, Howze became known as the father of the air cavalry. In a way, Howze was a living proof of Herr's argument that cavalrymen brought something unique to modern warfare. While his father's legacy was about heroism on horseback, Howze Jr. was all about adaptation. He used the cavalry instincts to shape a new kind of battlefield on his own terms. But not every cavalryman's story was a smooth transition. Colonel Harry A. Paddy Flint. Some cavalrymen clung to the old ways with fiery stubbornness, trying to prove bravery was more important than the weapons at hand. Only a few men were able to capture that spirit better than Colonel Harry A. Paddy Flint. He refused to let age, convention, or even death itself silence the charge. In June 1943, the Allied forces arrived in Sicily from North Africa after bringing German Panzer Army Africa to its knees and winning control of the region. The Allied forces landed on the southern beaches of Sicily early on the morning of July 10, 1943. 80,000 troops were brought ashore, and among them was Colonel Flint. At age 55, he was considered too old, but still fought bravely like a young soldier. He gained notoriety for his daring actions. Even General George Patton, commander of the American 7th Army, was impressed. Flint's career began in the 4th Cavalry after graduating in 1912 from West Point. His first duty was to patrol the Philippines while training and upholding the Army's equestrian tradition. By World War II, he commanded the 39th Infantry Regiment and the 9th Infantry Division, despite being considered too old for frontline duty. He didn't let the talks get to him. Instead, he proved his worth on the battlefield in Sicily. Flint transformed a worn-out regiment into an elite fighting force. He gave them a slogan nobody could ignore, the popular AAAO, meaning anything, anywhere, anytime, bar nothing. He ordered his men to have it written on all of their helmets, despite the fact that it was against the military orders. When asked why risk revealing their identity to the enemy, he replied, "If the enemy sees our regiment in battle and lives, he'll know to run the next time he sees us coming." In a letter to his wife Beatrice, written on June 17, 1944, he wrote prophetically, "Paddy is in and took a town. He expects to be killed and probably will be." His prediction was proven right 1 month later. Flint became very famous for his leadership style and dangerous stings, and he rode atop a tank through hedgerows, calling in fire in pillboxes, but his risky nature cost him his life. A sniper's bullet struck him during an assault near Saint-Lô. Gravely wounded, he crawled until he got to a shelter and died the next day. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, many Silver Stars, and the Purple Heart. To some, Flint was an old-fashioned risk-taker, stuck in the past. But others saw his cavalry roots as the source of his grit, discipline, and audacity. General Manton S. Eddy. This man was unlike Paddy Flint. Although he had the same fiery, unyielding spirit as Flint, his was sharpened into cool and calculated leadership. A thoroughly disciplined man, it was no wonder he was a hero of both World Wars I and II. Born in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1892, Eddy's military career began to take shape in 1916. He rose through the cavalry ranks, learned horsemanship, sharpened his saber skills, mastered the classic art of mobility and maneuver. But like most of his generation, he came of age just as the horse was being abandoned for tanks on the battlefield. While some officers struggled to adapt to the modernization of the battlefront, he adapted, transferring all the principles of cavalry to mechanized infantry and armor. His dedication and composure got the attention of his superiors, and this quickly propelled him forward through the ranks. As a commander, he was the kind of leader soldiers trusted to get them through the worst days of war. Under his leadership, his division, the 9th Infantry Division, pushed through North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, proving time and again that the qualities of cavalry speed, adaptability, and relentless drive still define battlefield success, even when carried out with rifles, artillery, and tanks instead of horses. Leading his men first through the deserts of North Africa was a daunting task, as none of them were accustomed to the heat and unending sandstorms. There, he taught his men how to fight in the blistering heat, move with agility, and strike hard and fast, much like the cavalry raiders of old. Then came Sicily, where the division's prowess was unmatched. Their speed and flexibility outflanked dug-in German forces, proving again that Eddy was an expert maneuverer. However, the deserts of North Africa and the Mediterranean terrain of Sicily were no match for the events in Normandy in 1944. After the bloody D-Day landings, it was Eddy's 9th Infantry that pushed through the seasoned German defenses. It was a vicious close-quarters battle, and morale could have been broken. After all, the Germans were expert modern fighters. But Eddy's leadership, calm, measured, and always forward-looking, kept his men grounded. His division became one of the first to break through, opening the way for the great Allied dash across France. Eddy's steady resolve would again be tested during the brutal winter of 1944 to 1945 at the Battle of the Bulge. His 12th Corps held the southern shoulder of the German salient, delaying the enemy while buying precious time for the Allied counterattacks. Once the tides turned, Eddy pushed his men hard into Germany itself. They captured Nancy, a key crossroads city, then drove through the Mosel-Rhine-Saar triangle, dismantling some of the last major German defenses standing in the west. Eddy's style was quite different from generals like Patton. Patton was a showman, the cavalryman turned armored knight. Eddy was quieter, but no less rooted in the cavalry tradition. Although there was a huge contrast in their style, they both had a complex, stormy, yet close-knit relationship. Eddy was often referred to as Patton's right-hand man. Eddy embodied endurance, while Patton's aggressive nature was all for a cause, to cover himself with military glory. Both qualities came from the same source: the cavalry's instinct to keep moving, to never let the enemy rest, to outlast and outmaneuver with every weapon in their arsenal. The demands of constant campaigning came at a heavy personal price. Years of strain wore him down, and by the final months of the war, high blood pressure forced him to relinquish command of the 12th Corps. He retired as a lieutenant general in 1953, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Legion of Merit. Dwight Eisenhower's wartime papers note that Eddy's calm, steady leadership was critical in France. Unlike some showman generals, Eddy inspired confidence through steadiness, which proved that cavalry values weren't just about daring charges, but also about the quiet courage to lead men through grinding campaigns to victory. And yet, not every hero dreamt of leading thousands of soldiers to victory. Charles H. Coolidge. Charles never wanted to be a hero. He was drafted as a quiet, steady Tennessee printer's son. But on a hill in France in October 1944, with only a handful of green troops to fight off 2 German tanks, only one man stood bravely in the open with a broken bazooka, calling out to the Germans, urging them to come closer. That man was Charles H. Coolidge. Before his most famous act of bravery, he served as a technical sergeant and a machine gun section leader in Company M, 141st Infantry Regiment. His division fought in North Africa and was the first American combat division to land on the European continent, participating in the invasion of Italy at Salerno. He was also part of the troops fighting at the Rapido River and Anzio, where he earned a Silver Star for his actions. In late October 1944, his unit was positioned in France. It was a 4-day attack at Hill 623, east of Belmont-sur-Bouton, in the Vosges Mountains in France. The enemy infantrymen, plus 2 tanks using grenades, were closing. Coolidge and his men tried holding them off with 1 tank firing 5 separate rounds at Coolidge, all of which were unsuccessful. He continued to advance on the tanks with his bazooka, and when it failed, he used grenades to inflict casualties on the enemies. His bravery and leadership allowed his men to eventually withdraw without suffering any casualties. He was the last to leave. In recognition of his extraordinary bravery in battle, Coolidge received the Medal of Honor from Lieutenant General Wade H. Heislip in a ceremony held at an airfield near Dornstadt, Germany, on June 18, 1945, according to the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. The ceremony at Dornstadt was more than just a formal recognition. It was a testament to Coolidge's steady courage. By the time he stood on the field ready to receive his award, the war in Europe was already winding down. The guns were beginning to go silent, and the world had begun to reckon with both the destruction and heroism that defined the war. For Coolidge, the Medal of Honor wasn't the end of his service. He continued to lead his men with the same calmness and determination that carried him throughout countless fights. And when the war was over, Coolidge returned to his home in Tennessee to live a simple life as a quiet American veteran. Yet his name lived on in the Army and beyond. Over time, schools, memorials, and stories honored his legacy. In fact, he went on to become one of the longest-living Medal of Honor recipients. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce C. Clarke, General Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, "The Army has had 2 great trainers, von Steube and Bruce Clarke. Bruce Clarke, considered the architect of modern military leadership, is renowned for his expertise in armored warfare, innovation, and training. He came from a working-class family with little to no privileges. He started as a private, fought his way up, and earned his commission through sheer grit. He served in various engineering roles before transferring to the armored force in 1942. He was known as a commander who truly understood his men because he was one of them. He was particularly celebrated for his leadership at the Battle of Aricourt in September 1944, where his smaller force of tanks and tank destroyers defeated a much larger German armored force. Obsessed with results, Clarke was not so interested in ceremonies. His defining moment came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had launched a surprisingly massive offensive through the Ardennes, hoping to disrupt the Allied lines and force a negotiation on their terms. The small Belgian town of Saint-Vith became one of the most critical points on the map. If it fell quickly, it'd split open the northern shoulder of the Allied line, rolling towards Antwerp and cutting off supplies to hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Clarke was then commanding Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division. His task was to hold Saint-Vith, but his forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and with few resources, they were facing some of Germany's most experienced units. Instead of panicking or pondering how to surrender, Clarke went straight to improvising. Using mobile defense tactics, he organized his men into a flexible web of resistance. Instead of holding grounds regularly, they struck, fell back, regrouped, and struck again. This went on for 6 days, and they succeeded, confusing the enemy while buying precious time against overwhelming odds. The U.S. Army Center of Military History credits Clarke with organizing the defense of Saint-Vith. The delay gave reinforcements time to arrive, and slowly the German offensive began to lose momentum. This impressive form of defense was argued to be as important as the better-known defense of Bastogne. The Allied defense, famous 101st Airborne Division, saw American paratroopers encircled by German forces, but refused to surrender, and their resilience became a symbol of Allied determination, just like the equally critical stand at Saint-Vith. Nevertheless, Clarke went on to rise through the ranks, eventually retiring as a 4-star general, a master strategist, turning the tides with brains instead of bravado. Major General Hobart R. It's easy to focus on men like Patton, whose larger-than-life personality made him famous. However, not every cavalryman's legacy was written in bold headlines. Major General Hobart R. was one of those unsung but essential cavalrymen who shaped victory from behind the scenes. He wasn't the face charging at the front, but the steady hand turning Patton's wild energy into organized, unstoppable momentum. Born in Rock Island, Illinois in 1894, Gay graduated from Knox College in 1917. Although he had some cavalry training, the world was leaning towards mechanization. He began his career with the saddles and saber, imbibing the fundamentals of scouting, shock action, and the right bonds between men and their commanders. The outbreak of World War II exposed him as a skilled staff officer. According to the Patton papers, Patton, himself a former cavalryman, recognized Gay's potential and picked him to serve as his chief of staff before leading the 1st Cavalry Division in the Pacific. Patton was a very demanding commander and needed officers who could keep pace with his relentless drive. Gay proved to be a perfect fit. Throughout the war campaign all over the continents from North Africa, Sicily, and into Europe, Gay was the man behind the curtain of Patton's armored thrusts. While Patton commanded the war front with fire and fury, Gay worked in the shadows, making sure the massive machinery of war kept up with the pace while handling logistics and communications. He converted Patton's cavalry's inspired aggressive nature into actionable orders, ensuring their men could punch deep into the enemy's territory without collapsing from overstretch. In December 1994, during the Battle of the Bulge, the German forces were desperate to gain ground, and so they launched a counteroffensive. Patton and Gay were prepared. They had orchestrated one of the famous maneuvers of World War II. Within days, the Third Army pivoted 90 degrees, racing north in the freezing weather conditions. Eventually, they succeeded in relieving the besieged paratroopers at Bastogne. They were fast, unexpected, and delivered a huge blow to the enemy. Gay's ability to organize such a rapid redeployment under pressure was a direct reflection of his character and dedication to the Allied cause. He became Patton's most trusted lieutenant, not because he mirrored Patton's fire, but because he balanced it. He brought order not just to Patton's chaos, but to the war as well. General John Sedgwick. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. These were the last words of General John Sedgwick before he was struck down by a sniper's bullet to the head. His words were a response to his men's warnings to take cover from Confederate sharpshooters during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse on the 9th of May, 1864. His almost mythical end became one of the famous and tragic reminders of a soldier's courage under fire. Born in Connecticut in 1813, John Sedgwick graduated from West Point just in time to see action in the Seminole Wars and also the Mexican-American War. Like many officers of his generation, bravery and discipline were foremost. These two would later shape his leadership during the Civil War, where he became one of the Union Army's most respected corps commanders. He became a brigadier general at the beginning of the Civil War and led a division at Antietam. There he was seriously wounded and was sent to recuperate. He returned to duty in 1863 and was placed in command of the 6th Corps, a massive fighting force that often held the line when other units faltered. He led them at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. By the Overland Campaign, he was already the Army's highest-ranking officer, only after Meade. His men, loyal and brave, affectionately nicknamed him Uncle John, a testament to the trust and confidence he inspired. He was calm and steady, much like Hobart Gay. However, after a severe march, the 6th Corps arrived at Spotsylvania on the afternoon of May 8th. After dark, it took its place in the center of the Union line, with its right flank resting on the Brock Road. The 5th Corps took its place to the right, and eventually the 2nd Corps extended to the left. Sedgwick established his headquarters approximately 100 feet from this spot. Meanwhile, the Confederate sharpshooters were prepared and spent the next morning sending bullets flying around the area, wounding, amongst others, General William Morris. Seeing the danger and moving without caution, his men warned him to take cover. Sedgwick's response became his famous last words as a sharpshooter's bullet came crashing into his skull just below his left eye. General Jonathan M. Wainwright. If there was a man who embodied the suffering and the endurance of World War II, it would be General Jonathan M. Wainwright. Nicknamed Skinny due to his lean frame, Wainwright was a career cavalry officer. Graduating from West Point in 1906, Wainwright began active duty in horse cavalry, mastering the traditions of maneuver, speed, and leadership in the saddle. Although, like most of his peers, he made a late transition into mechanized roles, he never lost the values forged on horseback. When World War II erupted in the Pacific, Wainwright was stationed in the Philippines. After General Douglas was ordered to evacuate in March 1942, command of U.S. and Filipino forces fell to Wainwright. It was an impossible task. There were few resources, his men were starving, they were outnumbered and battered by relentless assaults. Yet Wainwright was a firm believer in fighting until there's nothing more to give. Wainwright led a desperate yet gallant defense, first on the Bataan Peninsula and later in the tunnels and bunkers of Corregidor Island. He was seen moving among troops, calm and resolute, even as shells exploded around them. He wanted to share in the hardships of his men, refusing any form of comfort or privilege. His forces held out against all odds for nearly 5 months, delaying the Japanese troops from a complete takeover of the Philippines, while tying down enemy resources that might have been used elsewhere in the Pacific. Despite all their efforts, a sad end was inevitable. Starved of supplies, with no reinforcements coming, Wainwright was forced to make a heart-wrenching decision to surrender Corregidor on May 6, 1942, and the famous Death March began. The infamous Bataan Death March was a brutal 65-mile trek where thousands of American and Filipino soldiers died from exhaustion, starvation, and abuse at the hands of their captors. Approximately 75,000 prisoners of war were forced on the march. Only about 50,000 survived. They were too exhausted or ill to keep pace. Some fell behind, and those who attempted to get water or food were subjected to extreme violence. Many were beheaded, shot, beaten to death, and even buried alive. Wainwright became the highest-ranking U.S. officer to fall into enemy hands during the war. He spent the next 3 years as a prisoner of war, moving from one Japanese prison camp to another, enduring brutal captivity. Emaciated and frail, many feared the worst. Yet he survived, clinging to the same iron will that had sustained him on the battlefield. Wainwright was finally liberated in 1945 when Japan finally surrendered, and he returned to the United States a hero. Despite his profound guilt, in 1946, President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor, calling him a symbol of gallant endurance. In many ways, Wainwright was the last of the great cavalrymen. His ordeal brought an end not just to the age of the horse soldier, but also to the end of the war against humanity. And that's why when we look back at World War II, at its heroes, its battles, its sacrifices, we can still trace the imprints of the cavalrymen, not just in how wars were fought, but in how courage was defined.